Hello Sim Racers, and welcome to the first Race Sim Central podcast, where grizzled old simmers sit in a darkened room and talk about sims of yore. My name is John Denton, and I'm here today with Simon Croft and RSC founder Tim Wheatley. Good afternoon, Tim. How are things going?
Good, thank you. How about you?
Yeah, not too bad. How are things going, Simon?
Yeah, just rumbling on in an old grizzled manner.
So, Tim, what have you been simming recently?
Oh, it's been all retro for me. I've been going back and playing the Papyrus Classic IndyCar Racing, number 1, not number 2, which runs in a fabulous 320 by 200 resolution that's stretched to 240, and it's a very well-rounded sim. And the more time I put into it, the more feel I get back from it, and it's actually been a really interesting experience to go back and feel like my brain is almost filling in a lot of those physics details to the point where I'm not sure I can tell the difference between a modern and a retro sim anymore.
Do you think, how well does it really hold up? I know that it will have certain issues like working in 3 dimensions. You can't tip the car up on 2 wheels or anything like that, can you? But how does it hold up on a sort of lateral plane?
It's pretty good. You can definitely feel weight transfer in that, if you are far too sharp with the steering, combining that with the throttle, you can definitely feel that. And, I'm always a little bit wary of saying maybe that you can feel it, because I'm not sure if it's my brain kind of filling in the detail, but it definitely appears so to me. And there's a lot of gameplay in that title that I don't really remember as a kid. I think I remember mostly as a kid turning around, going the wrong way, and seeing how big of an accident I could cause. But now it's a really solid experience, and I actually think I might try to do a full championship at some point.
What, with full length races?
Yeah, absolutely. There's
Nice.
I did a full-length race at the Michigan Speedway the other day, and I passed for the win with like 2 laps to go. The AI were much faster than me when they were slipstreaming me, so I basically had to wait for the right time and then hope that they couldn't catch me. But I was actually helped a little bit because one of the AI slightly slowed up the other one, and I managed to get past them and create enough of a gap that on the final lap they were catching me, but they didn't get to pass me. So
And
it was a great win.
how well do the AI deal with pit strategy and things like that on a 200 lap race?
It's pretty basic. I think they have a pit window, and they seem to be fairly consistent, although they didn't all come in on the same lap and things like that. I only had 1 caution the whole race, which was quite surprising to me because I remembered the AI being much worse. And I was pretty wrong about that because I'm using a vanilla install with the default car set, everything like that. And they didn't stumble over each other. I didn't stumble over them. We got to do a lot of green flag running, and they just went into the pits in various small groups over a few laps, and they were on the same strategy as me. So I think it worked great.
Fantastic. I mean, it's what 1993, so it's 30-year-old sim now. Did you ever play that one, Simon?
I can't say I have.
No,
My journey started much later than that.
One of the finest things I remember about IndyCar Racing 1, and I think it was a feature in IndyCar Racing 2, was the way that when you were in the setup scenes, you were actually in a garage, and the camera would zoom around the car and look at the various aspects. And I think that's something modern sims could start doing to give more relevance to the setup stuff. Like people often talk about setup pages just being this wall of numbers, and like where the camera would zoom around the car, it gave you a much better, like, as somebody who was quite young then, I didn't know what camber was or caster or anything like that, and so to zoom around the car and actually give me a visual representation of what I was doing with those things was really useful.
Makes it all a bit more tangible.
Indeed.
Relates to what's going on.
So what have you been simming, Simon?
So unfortunately, my adult time is far more limited than I'd like, but my go-to of late is just dipping in and out of Assetto Corsa from time to time. I go back to my 2 or 3 favourite cars, so namely the Group A E30 M3 DTM version, the Audi Quattro, and also the Group A Toyota Celica. So the M3 tends to get rattled around Mugello. The Celica tend to take on some of the smaller, tighter, twistier circuits. And then the Quattro, there's the Highland circuit. I can't remember its proper name in the game, but it's basically got some corners and some long flowing bits so you can stretch its legs a bit.
Oh, that's the circuit that's like a drive through the Lake District, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Quite wide and flowing, but then there's some sort of slightly tighter, twisty bits and a little residential section on cobbles. So you get to you wall to roll briefly.
I presume in the Audi you get up to absolutely ridiculous speeds on those roads.
Yeah. You
terrifying.
You use the brakes to their full ability. Put it that way.
Well, the only retro simming I've been doing recently has been I fired up a PS2 emulator and got Gran Turismo 4 going again, and got myself delved into a bit of a career there. PC SX2 emulator allows you to do some pretty trick things with anti-aliasing and making these older titles look a lot prettier, and actually it's surprisingly good how good it made Gran Turismo 4 look. I do seem to remember even in the PS2 days that Gran Turismo 4 was, like, when it came out, we were like, this is the best looking game I've ever seen in my life, whenever it was, 2002 or something. But it's obviously with age doesn't look quite as good.
Yeah, I remember that for a long time it felt like the Gran Turismo series was almost the title that sold the graphics that a console was actually capable of. It kind of seemed like the showcase for the console. But I was wondering, like, same as IndyCar racing, how did it compare as far as physics and feel and even gameplay? Because I think a lot of people look back on GT4 as still being the best one of the bunch.
Yeah, it does tend to be regarded as the peak. It's interesting, really, because I think some of the complaints about the modern Gran Turismos is that there's too much grind, whereas I think in Gran Turismo 4 there's even more grind. Certainly in all of the earlier ones, Gran Turismos 1 through 4, you got a lot less money for your effort, and so you would end up having to, certainly in the early game, you would end up having to redo races quite a lot. And just to get enough money to be in a position to buy the next car or whatnot. Whereas I think, certainly, I mean, last year I was playing Gran Turismo 7 a lot, and I think comparatively it gives you a lot very early, and you're getting given free cars left, right and centre, and a lot of those cars are then useful for the next championship along the line and things like that, and it basically feeds the gameplay quite well. Whereas in Gran Turismo 4 I was finding, I bought like a Toyota Celica, and the meagre amount of money I was getting for winning these lower level races, I was able to upgrade the turbo, upgrade the brakes steadily, and then I'd try to enter sort of the next series up along the line, and I'd be absolutely blown away and end up coming like 5th or whatnot. And you have to do a lot more what is grind. I mean, I don't really hold with the grind thing so much, because it is doing, like you call it grind, but it's doing car races, which is what the game is. So, I don't know, like, it's not like when you get to the end of that grind, you're not going to just be doing more car races anyway. But it's a strange one where AI-wise, it doesn't hold up that well. But then again, I don't think Gran Turismo was ever really that strong on that front. Like, it's very much a game in that sense, rather than a sort of serious sim. Like, there's no qualifying, you always start last. That's part of the challenge of what Gran Turismo is about, as the gameplay basically is that you have to win that race from the back every single time. And, it's not about a sort of realistic motorsport simulation in that sense. But I mean, I thought the AI was better than better than I had remembered it being. But I think I was also better at driving it than I probably was in 20 years ago. But some of the tracks look surprisingly good. Their rendition of Motegi, for instance, is absolutely glorious, and Suzuka as well. I've not really, as I say, I played probably for about 5 hours and still didn't get very far. And this is where I think the game was a lot harsher on us than the more modern ones are.
How well does the force feedback translate on more modern equipment? Because that was that sort of Driving Force GT era wheel?
Oh no, it was before that. That was on the PS2. I don't even know if there was such a thing as a force feedback wheel on the PS2. Tim might know that one.
I don't think there was. No, I don't think
think
there was anything like that. I would actually be surprised if there was more than one or two steering wheels at that point, and I think they were pretty basic.
Yeah, with like 90 degrees turning radius. And
so does it have any force feedback then, or is it just sort of weighted feel?
Oh, I mean, I'm playing it on a controller, Simon. So
okay,
I don't know. I looked at the controls options, and I don't think there's anything in there for wheels at all. So where all the more, when I say more modern, I mean like from the PS3 era, Gran Turismo's onwards, they had default presets in for things like the DFGT, Driving Force Pro, and the G25. There's none of that in there in GT4. So I don't think there was necessarily any wheel support, but maybe if you'd have plugged in one of those terrible Mad Catz wheels that tended to exist, then maybe it would have worked. But as I say, you probably would have had 90 degrees motion on the wheel, and it would just be translating what the steering axis on the controller is doing. So, you're using liberal amounts of steering help and braking help and things like that just to get round, but can be quite good. The weight transfer is very good, and you can sort of kick the car sideways and things like that. But I don't. If it's not high fidelity, and would if it was much more high fidelity, it would require a decent control system anyway. Right, so moving on. For this inaugural podcast, I've asked our pundits, Tim and Simon, to arrive with a talking point of discussion, something that tickles their mind in the world of sim racing. So, Tim, how do you feel about getting us started with your choice for today?
Thanks. My topic is roleplay, which it's a word that I think a lot of people don't understand the context of. When I'm using it for this kind of thing, but. The thing that really appealed to me with racing games as a kid was kind of putting myself in the race, racing the heroes that I saw on TV, and I did this with Sims for many years, where I would find out the real race result. I would edit the AI so that they finished in a realistic order, and then I would go through the process of putting myself in that race, putting myself in that championship, and basically going head to head with my heroes. And I would try to replicate things as realistic as I could, and try to just basically do the best that I could. And so sometimes I would put my own team in there. If it was a season in, for example, Grand Prix 1, which shipped with quite a lot of different Formula 1 teams, and in later seasons, as there was less Formula 1 teams, obviously there was too many AIs. So I would make the slower AIs, so that they would qualify at the back and stuff like that, to kind of dump them out of the race during qualifying. And I would take over one of the teams myself with some made-up teammate, and I would go out there and try to win.
Was your made-up teammate one of somebody you knew, one of your friends from school or something like that?
Quite often it was like a retired driver, or I actually had Senna as my teammate for a while after '94. and kind of kept him racing. And with the NASCAR side especially, because I didn't really know that NASCAR existed before I bought the first NASCAR racing title. And then I realized that there was race reports on it, like back in the rear end of Autosport magazine. Yeah. And they would just show the top 20. So I had to figure out from the points where to put everybody who was outside the top 20 as far as the AI speeds went. But yeah, it was a really interesting thing to do, and I used to completely role play my way through the season, where if I basically got in a really serious accident, I would consider that, I was done for that season, and then I would restart with a new season, where I'd healed up and was fit and ready to go again. And it really added something that is certainly missing today, especially with a lot of titles that don't even have like a championship mode.
But would you have, say, skipped qualifying if you crashed heavily in FP3 or something like that?
Yeah. I basically tried to be as realistic as I could expect to be. Back then, with most of the Formula One titles, you had a couple of qualifying sessions to
Friday and Saturday,
to try to get a time in, which I wish they would go back to, but that's another topic. But yeah, I tried to role play as realistic as possible, and it really added something. Like every mistake mattered, in a way that it really doesn't so much today. The whole kind of shift R thing that came in, and the debate on that was in the Record Auto Simulators news groups, that it wasn't really a feature that a lot of people liked because they didn't feel it was realistic that you could just reset your car. I never gave myself a shift R.
I must say, I did exactly the same thing with F1 GP. I think I did seven seasons of a career. In one season, indeed, with Benetton, I believe, a friend of mine that we used to go karting together was my teammate. We had F1 GP Edit, right? And you could change the colour schemes and everything. So I remember changing the Williams over to a Rothmans livery and things like that. And also, I think in '97, Michael Schumacher moved to Williams and things like that. And because I was obviously the races, as I was going through the races, I was way ahead of the real seasons. It would happen much faster for me. So I think, I probably ran through 7 seasons over the course of 2 years or something. And so, I was developing and bringing in people that because again I'd read through Autosport religiously, and I was reading about people like Jan Magnussen dominating the Formula 3 championship, and so I brought him in. And in F1 GP Edit you could edit the AI's performance levels and things like that, and the car performance levels to adjust it. So I just sort of made a full hobby of that. I remember having a full notepad where I wrote all the results in as well. Very, very, very sad, but it added a great deal to it. But it's interesting you say that, where some sims now don't even have the championship mode. You can't really replicate the same thing, and it doesn't give the same gravitas to the events within the game. I think I've found with a lot of modern sims where you do a sort of race weekend, you get to the end of it, and then you'll just sort of bomb back to the menu and you sort of think, okay, well, what was the point in that? And what have I, what have I got out of it? But it's not quite the same thing.
When you're talking about like editing the AI and stuff, if you're taking the approach you're describing, both of you, and so you're then not just thinking about kind of like who the competitors are in the season, but also it's affecting how you're actually approaching an individual race. If I'm going to make a mistake, that's me basically out, even if the game doesn't punish you. Did you find that made the game relative to the AI much harder? So you had to kind of slow them down because it was almost set up as a game allowing you to do whatever you could get away with? Or did you find actually driving realistically, or as realistically as you could, allowed you to perform at the level required to be successful in it?
I actually used to set the AI, and I still do when I want a decent race. I used to set the AI where they were fast enough for me to only finish at the position that I should have been able to finish. So I had to be 100% perfect in the race to finish where I expected to finish. If I was in a Jordan, for example, I in 1994. I might have expected to get the odd podium, and that's it. So when I would go through like a qualifying session, a few races, and I would get used to where I needed to put the AI, but yeah, I really only wanted to be as fast as I should be. And the thing with Formula One Grand Prix is that it didn't matter which team you drove for. Every player car was exactly the same speed. So basically, I did have to move the AI, faster to make my car the right speed that it should be, on the grid.
Yeah, so I think the player car was set at like 730 horsepower, and so you had to give the McLarens and the Williams 800, 850 or whatever to get them ahead. And I'd do exactly the same as Tim. If my season was with Minardi or whatnot, then if I was getting in the points, then I was fortunate, and that was, like I'd have a heroic drive to fourth place at Monaco or something like that. But then there'd be other circuits where I wouldn't be able to touch the top positions and maybe even the top 10, and then the McLarens and the Williams would be completely in a different race, but then obviously as my career developed, I signed an exciting deal with McLaren, and so I was able to race at the front all of a sudden and change things up. But then as a new season dawned, I would modify the AI again so that okay, well, I'm with McLaren now, but in 1994, the McLaren's not really that good, so I'm well behind the Williams and the Benetton, and I'd have to edit the AI accordingly. And so still, I was still score a couple of heroic wins with McLaren that year or whatever, but the championship went to Senna in the Williams, of course. So.
It was always... that's interesting. I actually replaced Senna in one of my
heresy.
Yeah, it's. I think that kind of ties into what you were saying about the grind, though. Is why did we have that impulse to almost give ourselves one, and actually set things up that way? And what was interesting about what you said about GT4 was that you were making these incremental changes to your car, and like still struggling. And I feel like these days, if you go into a lot of simulations with the AI, the upgrades almost don't count. It's it kind of doesn't feel like it makes that much of a difference to the vehicles, and I don't know if that's a skill thing where basically, almost like how they say, that you need to practice before you start messing with setups. You basically can be, the best sim racers can be as fast with the worst setup as the worst sim racer with the best setup, kind of thing. It just makes me wonder whether there's actually something to that it's that whether the games have changed or whether the players have actually changed. Would they still accept that challenge these days?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's sort of the nature of Formula One racing on the whole, but I don't think the modern Formula One titles really do it, do they? Because they have a career mode where you sign up for a lower end team, but that lower end team seems to be able to perform incredibly well regardless. I seem to remember I can't remember, I don't play all of these, but I think a few years ago I played one of the F1 titles and I came in as Renault, and at the first race I qualified fourth on the grid, and that the Renault was nowhere near that during that season, and it's to me that's immersion breaking. But I think maybe to a lot of people, if they want to drive their favourite car, they also don't want to necessarily drive around in 17th place. But to me, that's what a realistic simulation of Formula One racing is. Like, there's a reality of Formula One racing that, like, you know, people like Stefano Modena had entire careers where, you know, finishing in the points was a rarity, and that didn't negate their incredible skill, or it just meant that they were in a Brabham, you know.
I think it's, you know, very different people are looking for different things from titles and the experience, and for some it's, well, I think for everyone to some degree it's doing something often that you can't do in real life, but for some people that means having the experience of a F1 career, struggles and all, and for others it means, oh, I want to jump in the Ferrari and win the championship and not go through climb the ladder to get there. And I think, you know, likewise, you take something like Gran Turismo, some people just want to get in there and have and drive the fastest, most powerful car. Others want to start with the lowly, cheap, underpowered thing and, you know, slowly build up, almost replicate in a real life career, unless you happen to be incredibly well off.
I kind of wonder if seasonal releases are what killed this. You know, if I look back on Grand Prix 1, Grand Prix 2, I didn't buy Grand Prix 2 the year it came out. So, you know, I had a little bit longer with Grand Prix 1. You know, that was years and years of time.
There was a 3-year gap between GP1 and GP2 anyway, yeah. I mean, I bought GP2 exactly. The day it came out, to be fair.
I mean, you know, you could play through a season once, obviously, but you know, that's the thing these days, is that, you know, it might be a combination of seasonal titles and then having less time overall, you know, as you get older with, you know, family, whatever, or work, you know, you just have less time, and putting the time into multiple seasons within a single year just seems kind of impossible. You know, I wonder whether that's a factor for me, at least, and whether that's a factor for a lot of other people. But yeah, yearly titles, it's almost like, well, it's doing the next season for you.
Yeah, and have you even got the time to complete that season before the new title comes out?
Yeah.
In terms of your kind of, you know, the subject of roleplay and some of the things you guys have been describing, how do you feel any of this, if at all, translates to when you've got titles like, say, iRacing, where you are having seasons competing against real people? Sometimes it'll be the same people season after season, sometimes not. You know, does that almost remove the need for that because you are effectively having a lot of that experience for real? Or do you still find to kind of you adopt a certain mindset to make it a bit more than it maybe is just on the surface?
Well, I think in iRacing as well, at the moment, you have their AI is very good, and you can actually do exactly what we've been doing in the sense of creating an AI roster that is a series of drivers and set their AI characteristics and performance. So you could construct, in fact, you could probably spend 15 hours just getting your AI roster up to scratch. But, you know, like... Shift R is possibly where, as Tim was saying, that's where it kind of breaks down. And even in the online version of iRacing, you know, the idea that you press escape and your car is always restored, or press Shift R, in fact, and your car is restored to perfect straight away. It does give you that, but it's much more about the racing than it is about the simulation of the sport, I think.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say, because I mean the current Formula One titles, you know, they do have the flashback feature where you can go into the menu and you can rewind the replay and then tell it where you're going to restart from, you know, after you've crashed, and little elements like that have definitely kind of taken away a little bit, but that's a feature in a few things. But obviously that doesn't apply to online play with iRacing and stuff. So, you know, to bring it back to the role play, I would find that if I was consistent when I was using iRacing a lot, if I was consistent on what time I raced and what I raced, I would end up racing the same people. I would start to recognize the names. And even though there wasn't any kind of official declaration of rivalry or anything like that, I definitely had in my head that person beat me last time. And that was motivation, and essentially that is role playing. That's me getting it in my head that I have a rivalry with this person, that I've raced with them before, and I want to beat them this time.
As long as you're not screaming down the radio, the voice comms at them. I think you're right, especially in the sort of historic series, racing things like the Nissan GTP or even the Lotus 49 or Lotus 79, where the communities are a lot smaller around those cars. You do end up with more or less the same people, especially if you race at the same sort of times. I used to do a race like every Tuesday at about 6 p.m. and it wasn't always exactly the same people, but quite a lot of the same people would show up. I don't necessarily find it's as convivial as it could be, but that's I guess online gaming as a whole doesn't necessarily seem cheery and friendly. A little bit more aggressively competitive.
I guess that kind of role play and everything, it ties in a little bit to Simon's topic. I guess he could move on to that right now.
Yeah, there's definitely some overlapping areas. So my topic is persistence, and it's quite a broad one, but specifically it ties in with some of the points about sort of shift R and things like that, and it's something that I think is largely lacking from titles, and maybe your role playing was some way making up for what was missing. And I think in my mind it's a similar thing, and maybe it's an element of role playing itself. And it's basically for me, as I said, when my driving tends to be quite limited these days, and I pop into say Assetto Corsa, and I've got a few cars that I go to, even though I've got however many cars in there with all the DLC and stuff. And, in my mind, it's not just an E30 M3, it's my E30 M3, albeit within the title itself. There's nothing to distinguish it from anyone else's. It doesn't matter what mileage I've put on it, what scrapes I've had, what barriers I've gone into. It's basically every time just a brand new car. There's no history associated with it. There's no basically continuity from one session to another, one race, one track visit, etc. And a lot of this, I think, is seeds that were planted by what was promised by Racing Legends, and it's basically never come to fruition.
Was there a? I think it was one of the early Kunos titles. Wasn't there like a mileage recording for each car?
In
Yes.
Netcar Pro, I think they gave you they recorded the mileage overall that you had done. It wasn't per car, I don't think. Did
I think it counted
Nami
accidents as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That's probably the last sim that had the features that you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Well, the other thing about Netcar Pro is that you would, if you drove the car for 20 laps and the tyres were worn, the next time you started up the game and went into that car, the tyres were still warm. And this caught out loads of people because, again, Netcar Pro didn't have particularly good documentation, to be fair, and so people didn't necessarily know that this was the case. And you could see the tyres, and you could visually there was visual indications that they were worn out. But people would be like, I've been driving for 4 hours, and it just seems to get more and more difficult. And it's of course because the tyres were completely destroyed. And then they'd press escape, go back to the pits after they'd crashed or whatever, and start again, but not change the tyres, and you just had to go into the garage screen and change the tyres, and then you were away. But no one seemed to know to do that.
The whole session to session thing with R Factor 2 was a bit of a struggle for people too. Like they wouldn't understand that, if it rained, then the track was obviously green again with less grip, and they were kind of having to start over, building it up, and that was a new thing for sim racing at that point, pretty much. So yeah, the cold tires on top of that as well was really difficult for people. There was a lot of discussion on how realistic it was even, and we were constantly being told by real racing drivers like, no, you've got it right.
It's It's an interesting point, that, though, because where Sims have looked at to maintain persistence of the development of the racetrack through, say, a race weekend, there is no persistence on the car. And, in R Factor 2, maybe the racetrack is developing through that weekend, but, like, the car, you turn up at the next practice session and your car is brand new again. And there was never any... I think this is what you're getting at, Simon. Like, it was never any sort of like wear and tear, or it was never, you never had to get a long brake pedal or things like that, which I think Rally Sims did some of. The Rally Championship series of games, they had, I think in the WRC games now as well, it's sort of a feature of rally games that in between stages you go to the service park and have to make repairs, and you've got a certain amount of time for those repairs and things like that, and essentially your currency is time in that. And that was a similar thing in Netcar Pro, of course, where you have to sit in the pits for 20 minutes while you change your springs.
Yeah, and some of it, I completely understand why, some of these, like the notion that you crash a car and then you've got to wait a week while it gets fixed or something before you can drive it is not the way to necessarily grow your customer base in general. But it's also something that could quite easily be a setting if it were in there. I'm not suggesting that everyone should be doing this, and I don't know why they're not. I think for me, it's where roleplay comes in for me, probably, in how I approach these things, is I'm protective of my car, and if I crash it, I think, oh no, I've crashed that car that I've done all these miles in and that I love. But ultimately, it's all in my head. There's no effect of that. There's no consequence of it, other than my pride taking a bit of a hammer and me feeling a bit guilty. And I think it also extends to things, something that I think would be nice is that, if you've got a tracks tend not to sort of, you have persistence in the way you've been describing about like over a weekend and the rubbering in or something. But I'd really love to see a track where if someone has a big smash, a bit of barrier gets replaced, and then, next time you load that circuit up, there's a shiny new bit of barrier. Just little things like that, I think, would really add to a sense of continuity, but also immersion. You can imagine going back to a track where you smashed out whilst you were in the middle of a race and seeing that new bit of barrier, and it's like, oh yeah, I remember why that's there. It was my doing. I think is just part of the experience. Again, it ties in what we were saying before about like different people probably want different things from this, but I'm not necessarily personally so keen in simulating or experiencing a 20 race championship or something. I approach sim racing more as, I imagine I was fortunate enough to own one of these cars and I was going and doing track days or something like that. That's kind of, it's the amount of time and effort I've got to dedicate to this. And so that's kind of what would be, for me, in a way, a realistic or tangible thing that maybe one day I could do. And I just like the idea that, this is my car. I keep going back to, say, a few tracks to see if I can get better, or, I change the setup. I'm not interested necessarily in going from track to track to track or car to car to car. I kind of tend to personally adopt a much longer term relationship with a vehicle and a series of tracks, and it is, if in real life I had a car that I was to take to track, that's how it would be. I'm not going to have a garage full. I'm not going to be going all over the world to all these different tracks. I'm just going to have a few that I probably keep revisiting.
Would you want to get underneath your virtual car and drain the oil? Do you think that is a worthwhile gameplay aspect to have to say, change your brake pads? Or would you, or do you feel? I feel, for instance, that brake pads should be something that wears out on a car. And actually, this feeds into what I wanted to talk about today, which is degradation of the vehicles and the vehicle simulations. So we might as well sort of breach these subjects altogether, but essentially, if in a sim, your brake pads wear out over a series of sessions in the way that the rally sims would give you like a percentage, and you get to the end of the stage and it'd be like the brakes are at 70%, and then you finish the next stage and the brakes are down to 30%, and at which point you need to dedicate some time to getting the guys to fix that. But if that was in a more circuit racing scenario and your vehicle is persistent across the races you do, you might not have to let's say you don't have to replace the brake discs for 1,000 miles. So you do several races, several practice sessions, whatever. It might take a month or more of driving before you're ready to change those brake pads. I think that's worthwhile, but I don't. Do you think there's a worthwhile gameplay element in making you the mechanic and actually doing that sort of thing, like in Car Mechanic Simulator?
Well, this is I mean, I'm not suggesting necessarily that that's that's not necessarily what I advocate of going to that. I think if there's to be a point in, say, having oil degradation, brake pad wear, etc., I guess there's got to be some sort of currency to make it a worthwhile addition. So as you mentioned in like a rally title, it might be right, you've got an hour's service and you've got these tasks and they take a certain amount of time. What are you going to choose to have done? Do you get that suspension fixed but you're driving around with a smashed windscreen? Are you, have you changed all your tyres and stuff but you've not had time to address this issue? If you're talking about something like Gran Turismo, it could be like the currency is money. You get your prize money, but it's not just then, oh great, I can buy a bigger and bigger turbo. It's like I need to fix these things. Or if you do have the kind of, the mechanic simulation thing, then the currency is your time to do it. So I think there has to be something, otherwise it basically just becomes, oh, I just tick a box and reset it, and then what's the point? So I guess there has to be some kind of, for want of a better word, penalty to it that has to be kind of paid for in some way or another.
I mean, I think you could say, as you say, the currency of time, I think, is more critical on the most part, and integrating an economy is a bit of a strange thing. I mean, Gran Turismo does it, but it's sort of strange that the only way you can make more money is by doing races. And if your car's too broken, you can't do races, so you can't make more money. But then, maybe that's when you get presented with the game over screen and you have to start again. I don't really know. But I mean, giving the currency of time, and as you say, maybe you can save money by fitting the parts yourselves. But I mean, from the perspective of the developer having to add in a whole mechanic simulation for that purpose is interesting. I think as well, what I was just thinking is that, like, if you break certain parts or certain parts have failed, while you're at the racetrack, maybe you could have a situation where you can't obtain those parts, not until after the race weekend. And so, as with Tim's previous situation, you're out of that race weekend. You can't race. And before you go to the race weekend, you have to take a look at your vehicle and make sure you replace the springs before you go, or something like that.
I was thinking maybe it should be something where there's a gameplay tie-in or something like that, where, with iRacing right now, you have people that play the role of just being a spotter for the driver, and maybe you could have a mechanic, and if iRacing really wanted to, I'm sure they could develop a parallel title that hooked into iRacing, where basically someone had to be the mechanic. There's obviously a lot to that, but that's the dream world that we all want to live in. I think is where everybody gets their game that involves us, being able to go out there and actually drive the car, but there's someone doing every single aspect of it. There's a team owner, there's a team manager, there's sponsors being brought in, there's the mechanics, there's the spotter, there's the crew chief maybe setting up the car based on your feedback. That's the kind of dream world that I live in. That's never going to exist.
A lot of the sort of esports teams have race engineers as well, don't they? And people work that essentially assist with working on setup and telemetry analysis and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the difficult question for me really is that I agree with these concepts of persistence and degradation. I think that there are other simulator titles, flight sims and military sims that do these things already. I'm just trying to understand within my own mind whether it would actually bring any real benefit. I think it would change the way people go about racing to know that their vehicle, if they damage their vehicle enough, then they're out of the race weekend,
Well, I think it would help in the same way that I think F1 was helped by people being able to miss gears. I watched a series of 1980s Formula One races recently where I swear most of the passes were every time the guy in front missed a gear. When I think back to how much better I felt about that racing, when in actuality it was just the guy in front, making a mistake, or maybe his gearbox was sort of going. I think that those kind of changes to the car itself, whether it's tire wear, whether it's the fuel load, the little integrated parts that might make you faster towards the end of a run or slower depending on how you've driven. I think that factors into how good the racing is too, because you should be able to strategize on how you're going to drive the car just as much as when you're going to pit. And I think that is a really exciting part of racing, but yeah, it has to be done right, and that's really, really, really difficult. I think I'm not sure whether it was the last build or the build before with iRacing again. There was this big thing about the tires, and the NASCAR guys with their esports series, who basically figured out that they needed to underdrive massively to be able to gain a massive overall speed advantage.
Yep.
And just being able to figure that out, and then being able to obviously strategize and stuff like that. The one of the esports drivers who's won the championship, I think 5 times now, didn't qualify because it wasn't in this previous season for the NASCAR E series. I think basically based on not getting through that changed to the tire model, and that's pretty major.
Yeah, but the current crop of modern sims really make people look at the tires in forensic detail, but then not much else in the rest of the vehicle. Some Assetto Corsa Competizione has brake wear, and so that means that there is a degree of mechanical sympathy. But racing in motorsport in real life involves mechanical sympathy across the board, and you need to look after your vehicle in more than just the tires. Especially in endurance racing, if you want to get to the end of races. And I think at the moment, sims focus a great deal on the tires, and the rest of the vehicle is almost this functionary that sits on top of the tires, and could do with possibly a little bit more or solid vehicle simulation involved, really.
I think a lot of this would depend very much on, or in terms of the magnitude of the effect, or quite how it manifests itself in real life, would depend obviously very much on the series. But for example, there's a guy on YouTube I follow who races in the UK Toyota MR2 Championship, and so this isn't massive budget racing, and he's not got a massive budget, and so he's like, I've got these tyres, they're kind of knackered, do I run them again, do I run them at this practice test day, do I buy some new ones, but then I can't afford this, And in those instances, yes, you've got looking after your tires for the duration of a race. Do you save them so you're stronger at the end of the end of the race period? And you've got things like trying to mechanical sympathy to avoid kind of failures during the race. But there's also a much longer term consideration of right, these pads are getting pretty low, but they've still got some life left on them, so I don't have to buy new ones of those and things like that. And you can imagine almost extrapolating what you're talking about, Tim, in terms of that pacing yourself. You can imagine also pacing yourself over a season. It's like, am I going to have a car that's going to be able to turn a lap in 5 races' time if I just keep ragging it, basically?
That's this is interesting because I obviously licensed and went to visit with the Marussia Formula One team when they were in the for the Canadian Grand Prix in 2012. They went into that race knowing that their brake cooling wasn't good enough to finish the race, and they basically had Charles Pick of essentially pull back on pace, and they had Glock just basically go as fast as the car could go, knowing that he probably wouldn't finish. That they expected their brakes to fail. The Marussia MR01, which is in R Factor 2, you actually cannot finish a full race at Montreal if you drive the car in a realistic way. And the degradation of the brakes there. That's something that I obviously heard over the team radio, and I heard them telling me, and that they didn't expect the cars to finish. Pick actually did finish, but obviously he was pretty far behind. But yeah, it really does factor into it, not just at the kind of grassroots level that Simon was talking about, but it obviously really factored into what they were doing in the Grand Prix that weekend.
Yeah, and I think especially early in the season, you get that a lot in Formula One. With the limited amounts of testing, many teams might go into the first couple of races of the season not necessarily knowing if they're going to make it to the end. One question there, though, Tim: did the Marussia team know that you were modelling that in the sim, and did they feel that benefited their licensing? They're licensing out their product from a marketing perspective?
Well, unfortunately, we never got to do pretty much any of the stuff that they or that we actually talked about. As far as working together, it was a really slow process, licensing and everything, and just everything that was said just basically never happened. It was one of those things. But I do have an interesting kind of story that sort of relates. It's from the same company anyway. In R Factor 1, if you used the CD crack and obviously replaced the EXE to bypass the copy protection, you actually had increased brake wear.
Nice.
Yeah, that was their little thing that to combat piracy was basically in the same way that you would have people coming in the support forum that were complaining about certain things that were always happening with their software. As the support person, you would know exactly what was the problem, and that was that they obviously hadn't licensed the software, or that they were using a different EXE.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one as well in this respect, because I know that, well, yeah, I mean, from talking to certain developers who will not be named, working on certain sims that won't be named, with certain car manufacturers that definitely won't be named, they've had situations where the car behaves in a certain way, as evidenced in real life, in the real life races that take place for that real car. And when it is then simulated, the car manufacturer are not happy that essentially, that you're representing what a shed that car actually is. It was an interesting thing for me, obviously, writing recently about the 2022 Mercedes, which obviously had the terrible problems with porpoising and then oscillation and bouncing in the suspension. I don't think iRacing necessarily did 100% justice to how difficult that car was to set up and drive. I think if they had, it would have probably been quite difficult for most of the people that paid good money to buy it. But at the same time, it's, you can imagine that when their contract came together with Mercedes for that, they didn't necessarily want to represent a car that was that nearly every player was going to stick into a fence all the time. I'm sure many of them still find their way into fences nonetheless, but
yeah, and that's that's a broader topic, but and I know that you're a flight sim guy, so all of the switches and knobs and things are kind of exactly what you're looking for. But for me, I think that a modern Formula One car actually accurately simulated, as in a 2023 car, would be something that just simply wouldn't appeal to me, based on the fact that I wouldn't be able to even keep it running. I don't think. That's actually one of the most difficult things for me. I
don't know. It's got anti-stall.
I don't think there would be enough anti-stall in the world to actually help me through that. And I think as far as physics and everything, I think that's why old cars with no downforce really appeal to me, because they're really simple. Same as me. But the thing with the licensing, especially that you were just mentioning, is that's probably why Balance of Power is a constant edit with different developers, where they notice that one manufacturer is a lot faster in a certain way that it really shouldn't be, and they have to constantly keep tweaking that and bringing it back in line.
As of course they do in the real life series.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, well, I think that's about all we've got time for today. Thanks for listening. You can get in touch with us to ask any questions and give feedback, hopefully of the good kind. Tim, what were the best ways for people to get our attention on RSC?
Well, there is a contact page, but I've also just brought back some forums, so people can get in there and post in the forums, and obviously interact on various social media. It's always Race Sim Central, as all one word, and people can find us pretty much anywhere.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you next time.